Hello everyone, and welcome back to Translationborne, the show about translation, Bloodborne, and the translation of Bloodborne. This time, we begin with a look at an interesting relic. Eye of the Night Sky, soft eye blessed by spirits, remnant of the divine mystery Byrgenwerth once witnessed, but in the end it reflected nothing. Deep within that pupil, a dark night sky spreads out endlessly, and a storm of meteors blows wildly without ceasing. If the eye is so much as rubbed ever so slightly, that will likely come leaping forward. As usual, there are a few different aspects of this item's translation that I could touch on, and I intend to get to more of them in the pinned comment beneath the episode. But for the time being, I want to focus solely on an issue I know has affected my own translations in past episodes, and that probably impacted the official translators as well. That would be the difficulty in a game like Bloodborne of translating an item description both for its immediate context and for the way it fits into the wider web of text for the game. I bring this up now because there's an element of the official translation for the Blacksky Eye that I think better fits in with one of the potential ways to understand part of Bloodborne's story in Japanese. Specifically, the official English doesn't outright state that Byrgenwerth is the place where contact with the arcane occurred. It simply notes that Byrgenwerth had an encounter with holy mystery. You can see this in the Japanese because Byrgenwerth is given the subject-identifying particle ga rather than a location-specifying particle like ni or de. That's important because it means the Japanese may be using the term Byrgenwerth to refer to a group of scholars from the college who had some sort of otherworldly encounter, as opposed to implying that a mysterious meeting happened at Byrgenwerth. Of course, on its own, even this doesn't seem like much of a revelation, but when we tie it in with elements from a number of other item descriptions, it could help lend weight to an existing story based on certain implications of the Japanese. To see this, let's turn to the Japanese version of the Graveguard set. There's some ambiguous wording here involving the term shitagao that I myself missed in my initial translation analysis, much like I missed the possible implications of Byrgenwerth being referred to as a subject earlier. Anyway, the verb shitagao can either mean to follow in the sense of to obey one's master, or it can mean to follow in the sense of to accompany one's master. This is important because it allows us to interpret the Japanese as saying that at one point, Willem's servants accompanied him into the labyrinth, encountered holy mystery, and went mad. Now, I've talked about the term shimpi, or holy mystery, in the past, and how I think it can sometimes be used as a stand-in for a great one. As it turns out, that may be the case here as well. Indeed, there's a chance we even know which great one it was, because if we look at the Japanese for the description of the Eye rune, we learn that Carol, the runesmith of Byrgenwerth, transcribed the voice of the left-behind Great One. That's the same phrase used to describe Ebrietas in the Japanese version of the Augur of Ebrietas, the first line of which also happens to share the exact same phrase found in the second line of the Blacksky Eye. Putting all this together, it's possible that a group consisting of at least Master Willem, Doris, the future gate guard, and Carol descended into the Tomb of the Gods and met with Ebrietas. This meeting drove the two servants mad and resulted in the creation of the Eye rune. By this understanding, at least two relics would have been discovered in the process. The first would be the Augur of Ebrietas, itself a phantasm, and the Blacksky Eye, which was somehow blessed by a phantasm. Perhaps it was an eyeball imbued with arcane power from leftover slime, much like that we can use to enhance weapons via the empty phantasm shell. Anyway, as we also learn from the Augur of Ebrietas description, from that point on, Byrgenwerth began to inquire into the cosmos from within the old labyrinth, much like the choir would later look for the cosmos just above their heads, when, according to this theory, they rediscovered Ebrietas. There's even some possible symmetry in terms of the relics to consider here, because we know that the choir uses a phantasm in the failed rite A Call Beyond to reach a lofty plane of darkness and materialize a small exploding star. And it sounds like the Blacksky Eye involves using a relic blessed by a phantasm to reach a vast stretch of dark sky that ultimately signifies nothing, but allows for the materialization of a small meteor. Oh, and if you're thinking Carol and Willem can't have been contemporaries at Byrgenwerth, that's an implication limited to the official English translation of the Rune Workshop tool. Literally, the Japanese doesn't say Master Willem would have been proud of Carol's runes, but rather that Carol's runes are close to Willem's ideals. So while I'm no lore master, from all that I can see, this story of Byrgenwerth's encounter with Ebrietas is a completely valid interpretation of the Japanese. Looking at these passages as a translator, though, it's hard to see these disparate pieces of text as telling a single story, especially since it's doubtful they were all lined up next to each other. I don't know how the item text was organized for translation, but if we use the in-game presentation as a guide, the items fall into different categories: attire, runes, consumables, one of which was created months later than the other, and a key item to boot. If each category were translated sequentially under what by all indications was a tight time frame, it can't have been easy to see all the connections between them. I should know, because even without those constraints, I missed the core possibility on the Graveguard set and the Eye rune myself, until Last Protagonist pointed them out. And that's not even accounting for how even the valid interpretation outlined earlier could differ from the developer's intentions, or how we've seen evidence that the story for Bloodborne kept changing on the translators right up to the last minute. The point is, even without all those complicating factors, it can be difficult to translate a game with text as intricately connected as Bloodborne's, especially since translation itself is no easy task, as I believe this next item helps demonstrate. Hunting Hat of Maria. The first hunters who apprenticed themselves to Gehrman. The hunting hat of one of them, the female hunter Maria. The design of Cainhurst can be seen. She belonging to a subsidiary line of the Undying Queen. However, she idolized Gehrman, without even knowing of curious passion. This description is probably the best example we've seen so far as to why translators can't rely on the literal translation of Japanese text to produce good English writing. The first two lines of my literal version don't even feel like complete thoughts, because they're just strings of phrases attached to nouns. Furthermore, there are a number of nuances that the Japanese text relies on but never fully spells out, and the result is English that's so stilted it's hard to understand the core meaning, particularly of the third line. So, to work through what's going on in these first three lines, let's start by identifying what key information needs to be conveyed and what purpose the Japanese presentation is serving. Looking at the initial pair of lines, it seems to me that the reason the opening Japanese phrase is about Gehrman's students is to provide context for the first short Japanese phrase of the second line, sono hitori. This means one of them, and it shows us that the purpose of the original presentation is to set up the group that Maria was a part of. Meanwhile, in terms of key information, it's important to establish both that this group consisted of the first hunters and that they were apprentices to Gehrman. That's probably why the Japanese puts all this into a single phrase, so that there's no questioning whether Maria might have been one of the first hunters, but not a student of Gehrman's. Jumping back to the second line, though, we can catch another important detail, which is that Maria is identified specifically as an onnakaryudo, which literally adds the kanji for woman before the pair of kanji used to represent the word for hunter. That's important because in both languages, that identifier not only tells us that Maria was a female hunter, it also suggests that she was the only woman out of all of Gehrman's first apprentices, since her being a lady hunter is what distinguishes her, though admittedly that's not definitive. Speaking of implications, though, there's also some unwritten information to keep in mind when reading the Japanese, which is that since this is all part of an item description, the original text is banking on players understanding that the hat being described at the end of the second line is the one pictured as part of the set. Of course, this is also a reasonable assumption to make in English, but recognizing this underlying piece of logic helps us see how it's perfectly reasonable to use the phrase, "this was her hunter's cap" in English, with "this" referring to the item in question. As I mentioned earlier, however, the third line of the item description is where the non-literal connotations of the Japanese really need to be considered. Looking at my literal translation, it might seem like there's an emblem or something meant to be the design of Cainhurst that appears on each item in the set, but the original term, isho, makes it clear that the term design is being used more in the sense of, say, fashion design. In other words, this third line is saying that the attire's shape and features are identifiably in line with the visual style of Cainhurst. So, looking back at the official translation, now that we've gone through all that, we can see that it does indeed specify that Maria was part of the very first group of hunters, and that this group consisted exclusively of Gehrman's apprentices. It also identifies her as the Lady Hunter, much like the Japanese, and it lets viewers know that this is something she wore for hunting, as well as making it clear that the attire itself is tied to Cainhurst. The official English does seem to go a little further than the Japanese in asserting that it was literally crafted in Cainhurst, since by my understanding, it could just be that this new hunting gear was made elsewhere in line with Cainhurst's clothing design. But then again, saying that this clothing was made in Cainhurst does more strongly parallel Maria's own lineage, so at least on a thematic level, I don't mind that choice. In any case, the end result is a translation that takes the same information as the Japanese, but rearranges and reworks the presentation so it sounds good and is understandable in English. This is the bread and butter of translation, yet it takes a lot of time, effort, and skill to accomplish, even without accounting for things like cross-item connections or ambiguous phrases. Of course, since this is Bloodborne, those do show up too, including at the end of this very description. There's a phrase in the Japanese, koki no kyonetsu, that could be interpreted as having the noun, koki, meaning curiosity, modify the noun kyonetsu, meaning wild passion, to give us the phrase curious mania. However, it could also be taken the opposite way, such that it literally comes out to wild passion of curiosity. Understood in the first sense, it sounds like Gehrman was secretly obsessed with Maria and used her as the basis for the doll. Understood in the second sense, it sounds like if Maria had been aware of the maniacal level of Gehrman's curiosity, she wouldn't have idolized him, much like she disapproves of the player character's wild curiosity in searching her presumed corpse. Since as far as I can tell, there's no way to retain the ambiguity of the Japanese phrase in English, this puts the translators in the dilemma of having to choose between two valid interpretations of the language with lore implications. Now, it's possible that the official team may have been able to get some developer input when it came to making this decision, but either way, I think this situation helps demonstrate yet another way translation can be difficult when it comes to a game as interpretation-based as Bloodborne. For the record, I'd be inclined to go with the Curious Mania interpretation myself, since I see Maria's current position on Wild Curiosity to be one she arrived at after bitter experience, but that's just my take. And having said that, I think it's time we moved on to something new. Church Stake, one of the Healing Church's old device-installed weapons. Thing that is a large stake made into a hunter weapon, appears in old folktales of beasts. Functions as a large sword before transformation, or as a long-handled war pick after transformation. It is an extremely practical weapon in a way unsuited to its origin. To be honest, when I was planning out this episode, I thought I'd have gained a weapon from defeating those two giant shark enemies by now, and I only presented the church pick during recording when it was clear I'd need more time. Fortunately though, there are a couple aspects of this description's translation that fit in perfectly with one of the issues I've been discussing. Specifically, I think we're seeing some examples of how a basic understanding of Bloodborne's lore can sometimes simplify rather than complicate an interpretation. Consider the Japanese phrase, kemono no furui densho. Here, kemono means beast or beasts. The particle no can probably be safely replaced with the English word of. Furui means old, and densho refers to tales passed down through generations. In other words, this could somewhat literally be translated as old folk tales of beasts. Now, speaking purely from a linguistic perspective, it's possible that we can interpret this phrase as meaning that the beasts are the ones passing on folk tales from one generation to the next. I suppose it's also possible to get this idea from the official translation of old beast tales, but it doesn't require a very deep understanding of Bloodborne's lore to see that this is unlikely. While we do have one example of a beast that can talk in the form of the transformed man, every other bestial transformation seems to involve a loss of reason. Furthermore, even if we did accept that beasts were telling each other folktales, we've even less reason to believe that early members of the Healing Church would be listening to them. No, it's much more likely that the Japanese and the English phrases are referring to tales that feature beasts which have been passed on from one generation of humans to the next. This also fits in thematically with the idea of recurring scourges and cycles of civilization in the world of Bloodborne, because that could explain why this weapon is highly effective despite being based on old stories. Perhaps those tales actually represent wisdom from previous scourges, so a weapon that features prominently in them would turn out to be practical. In any case, I think it's plain to see that this is a situation where something that could be seen as linguistically ambiguous is actually given clarity by the rest of the game. For that matter, not every case of similar or parallel wording in the Japanese demands the same treatment in English. The church pick can provide us with an example of this as well, because if you look at how it describes the pre- and post-transformation states of the weapon, you can see a definite similarity to the descriptions of the saw cleaver and the saw spear. The official English, by contrast, parallels the two saws but not the church pick. True, part of this can be explained by increased repetition even on the Japanese end of things when it comes to the saws, but the overall grammatical structure of the Japanese is still more similar across all three items than the English. It's just that in this case, there's no greater significance to this grammatical structure the translators need to worry about. In such cases, the translator's ability to differentiate these passages is a strength. But now that those sharks are defeated, let's turn to one last item tied to Lady Maria. Fallen Leaves, hunting weapon of Maria, female hunter of the clock tower. It is a device-installed sword of the same country as Cainhurst's Thousand Views. However, it is a famous sword that demands not the power of blood, but a high level of talent in particular. Maria too liked that property of fallen leaves, and is said to have loathed blood blades, even while being of a subsidiary line to the Queen. However, at one time she threw away her beloved fallen leaves into a dark well, simply because she was weak of heart. So, in terms of translation, there are several nice touches to take note of here, such as the way the official translators have stuck to a transliteration of the weapon name to make it fit the naming convention of the faraway land that produced the Chikage. However, the main thing that interests me about this particular translation is the wording of the official English in the final line, and the way this could tie into our understanding of the story of Maria. Before going too far into the subject, though, I want to acknowledge that it's possible the official wording I put on screen for my earlier comparison may be slightly outdated. There is an alternative final section for the British English version of the weapon that omits the opening word but and ends by saying that Maria cast the weapon down a well when she could stomach it no longer, as opposed to its presence. These changes are small enough that they strike me as the result of editing to reflect different regional preferences, but it's possible that they actually represent changes to the Japanese text. For that matter, this discrepancy may suggest that the entire difference between the literal idea that Maria gave up the weapon because she was soft-hearted and the official presentation of her not being able to bear having the weapon on her anymore is due not to a translation choice, but to a subsequent update to the Japanese text, which the translators never got a chance to change. Even admitting that, though, I want to explore the possibility that this wording was a deliberate decision, because I think it could work very well with the story of Maria's life as we've been presented with it so far. To review then, based on what we've learned from both the Rakuyo and the Maria Hunter set, we know that Maria was a distant relation of Annalise, the Queen of Cainhurst. Given that her clothing is at least modeled on the fashion of Cainhurst, and the fact that she wields a weapon that made its way to Cainhurst, like the Chikage, it seems like she either grew up in that region or her family kept some of their ties to it. At some point, though, she decided to become one of Gehrman's first apprentices, and she admired him greatly. Meanwhile, depending on your interpretation, Gehrman may have used her as the basis for the doll. In any case, it seems likely that Maria participated in hunts with the Rakuyo and avoided making use of her blood, despite its presumed potency. Then something happened that seems to have changed everything. In the judgmental tone of the Japanese Rakuyo description, she became soft-hearted and threw the weapon down a well in what was probably the real-world version of the Fishing Hamlet. Also, while it's tough to say what happened in reality and what happened in the nightmare, we know at some point Maria started living behind the giant astral clock, where she became a source of comfort for the secret patients of the Healing Church. Despite this bringing out her softer side, though, the version of her we meet in the Hunter's Nightmare is so set against our discovering that place's deepest secret that she will ultimately abandon her aversion to the use of her blood and do everything in her power to kill us so terribly that we'll call off our search. And if this weren't enough to suggest that she was somehow tied to the misdeed that we've been told formed the Hunter's Nightmare, then there's also the tie between her presence in the nightmare and the doll in the Hunter's dream. Since the doll speaks of experiencing liberation when we defeat Lady Maria, it seems like some part of her was being held there, which in turn suggests that Maria was targeted by the curse. If that sequence of events is accurate, it seems like Maria was part of something that happened in the Fishing Hamlet which was so awful that it changed her utterly. That's significant, because it tells us that part of the purpose of the final line of the Rakuyo is to help us put together the effect of this horrible event on Maria's life. Her abandoning of the Rakuyo could thus be intended to signify her turning away from the life she led up to that point because it became too much for her. Evaluated in that light, I think all three versions we've looked at so far can be considered successful. When the Japanese calls her soft-hearted, it implies that whatever happened at the Hamlet was too much for her to bear. Meanwhile, while both English versions imply a little more strongly that it was Maria's own acts with the Rakuyo that she grew disgusted by, they still get across the idea that her regrets grew too strong for her to continue hunting and using the weapon as she had been. The question is, should we consider all that lore about Maria when evaluating the translation of this particular line? It's possible the translators knew more about this aspect of the game's story because at least some of it would also be relevant to the voiceover work. And of course they could have asked the developers for clarification about the text. but we've also seen a lot of evidence of things that seem to have fallen through the cracks, including the regional discrepancy in this very line. Personally, I find the resulting translations similar enough, and I believe they work with the lore well enough, that I'm inclined to give the translators the benefit of the doubt. But if you feel differently, or if you have any other opinions about the episode you'd like to share, don't hesitate to let me know. Your feedback is always appreciated. Alternatively, if you want to hear my take on any of the other subjects I've covered so far, remember that you can check the Translationborne Index linked below, which should be up to date within 24 hours. Until next time then, thanks for watching, everyone.